On the 11th of July, 1881, at 4 o'clock in the morning, off the southern coast of Australia, 13 men on the deck of the British corvette Bashanti saw a ship out on the ocean. It was moving against the wind. A red glow hung above it. The officer of the watch wrote the exact course and time into the ship's log. Among those who saw it that night was a 16-year-old youth named George. 39 years later, he would become King of Great Britain. His older brother, who stood beside him on the deck, would die sooner, at the age of 28, from an illness the doctors could never name. And on the morning of that very same day, on that very same ship, the first man to spot the vessel fell from the rigging and was killed on the deck below. 2 of the other sailors who had seen the ship in the night never lived to see home again. All of this is in the official log of the expedition. Not a single detail is invented. The ship they saw, sailors called the Flying Dutchman. This legend is known in every port in the world. A captain who swore to round the Cape of Good Hope at any price. A curse that doomed his crew to sail forever. A ship that appears before storms and foretells death to anyone who lays eyes on it. A red glow above the masts. Letters from the dead, which the phantom crew passes to living ships. This legend was retold by Walter Scott and by Heinrich Heine. Wagner wrote an opera about it. A British prince saw it, and a German submarine commander of the Second World War recorded it. It was described in the official reports of the Royal Navy. It was told by sailors who never learned to read, and by sailors with a university education. It is still told today. But did this captain ever exist? Was there a real ship from which all of it began? Why did sailors across 3 centuries see the same thing? Why did the legend appear here, by the Cape of Good Hope, and not at the dozens of other deadly places across the world's oceans? Who first wrote this story down, and when exactly did a captain who may never have lived become the most famous ghost of the sea in all of human history? And the main question, the one that every sea legend answers if you take it apart honestly. What did those people see? Because the men aboard the Bashanti saw something. The entry in the log exists. The lines from the diary of the future king exist. The names of the 13 witnesses are known. The ship that moved against the wind with a red glow above its masts was real for those who stood on the deck that night. This is a story about a ship that may not exist, and about the sea, which for so many centuries has given birth to it again and again. Stay with us. His name was Hendrick van der Decken. He was a Dutchman, the captain of a merchant vessel of the Dutch East India Company, the richest corporation humanity has ever seen. His ship was a great 3-masted flight, loaded with silk, spices and silver, sailing from Batavia home to Amsterdam. He was an experienced sailor. He feared neither storms, nor pirates, nor long crossings. He had rounded the Cape of Good Hope before, and knew this water better than his own face in the mirror. His crew feared him and respected him. He knew how to make a ship run faster than the wind allowed, and it was whispered that he knew words an ordinary sailor was never meant to know. The exact date of his last voyage is lost among the different versions of the legend. Some say it was the year 1641, others 1681. Others still name the middle of the 17th century without any detail. In different tellings, his name shifts a little too. Van der Decken, Van Straten, Valkenburg, but the heart of the story is the same everywhere. The ship was heading home. In the holds lay cargo for which they would have paid enough in Amsterdam that the captain need never go to sea again. On board was a crew of 60 souls. Among them, a priest who served the ship as chaplain and held a service for the sailors every Sunday. When the vessel drew near the Cape of Good Hope, what was bound to begin, began. Here the storms always began. The Cape of Good Hope is where Africa ends. Here two oceans meet, the Atlantic and the Indian. Here currents collide that come from two opposite ends of the world, and winds that blow from the pole and from the equator at the same time. The sea here is like no other sea on earth. The storm that met Decken was one such as he had never seen. The waves rose higher than the masts. The wind tore the sails like paper. The ship could not move forward. It only rose and fell on those waves, losing every mile it had won by unimaginable effort. The crew was afraid. The sailors prayed on their knees right there on the deck, holding to anything that could keep them from going over the side. The priest stood beside the captain and begged him to turn back, to shelter in Table Bay, to wait out the storm at anchor near Cape Town for a few days, perhaps a week, and put back to sea once it died down. The captain refused. He said he would pass the Cape at any cost, that no storm in the world would force him to turn back, that they would round Africa by Christmas, even if they had to sail until Judgment Day. The crew was terrified by these words. The sailors tried to raise a mutiny. The priest tried to hold them back and turn them toward the captain, pleading with him to come to his senses. Then Decken raised a pistol and shot the priest where he stood. The body was thrown overboard. The mutineers he ordered punished, some hanged from the yards, some locked in the hold without water. And then, as the storm grew worse and the sky turned black as the hold, he lifted his face to the heavens and shouted out his oath. He swore that he would pass the Cape. He swore that he would pass it, even if it took him until the end of the world. He swore against God. In that same moment the sky opened. A figure descended from the clouds. In some versions of the legend it is God himself, in others an angel, in others the devil, come to take what he was being offered. The figure asked the captain whether he understood what he had said, whether he was ready to bear the consequences of his oath. Decken answered that he was ready. He did not believe the one he saw. He fired his pistol at the figure, and the bullet passed through it without leaving a trace. He cursed the heavens once more, louder than before. Then the curse was spoken. The ship will not pass the Cape. The ship will never pass the Cape. It will sail around it forever, day after day, year after year, century after century, for as long as the sea exists. The crew will not be able to set foot on shore. They will not be able to die. They will not be able to fall overboard. They will remain on this vessel for as long as it stays afloat, and it stays afloat forever. Decken laughed. He did not believe it. He shouted to the sky that his ship would pass, that the wind would change, that the storm would die down. But when he turned back to the deck, he saw that the crew had fallen silent. The sailors stood without a word, and on their faces there was neither fear nor anger. They looked at him with empty eyes, and the captain understood that none of them would ever come home again. Not one. The ship turned against the wind and went around the Cape. Again, then once more. Then again and again and again, and so on, without end. In the legend there are conditions under which the curse may be lifted. Different versions name different conditions, and they changed over time, but the classic form is this. Once every 7 years the captain is allowed to step ashore. For one night only. If, in that night, he finds a woman who loves him truly and stays faithful to him until death, the curse will be lifted. The ship will be able to reach a port. The crew will be able to die as all people die and find their peace. But no one can love a phantom captain. He comes ashore at night, with eyes that have seen too many storms and skin that smells of salt that will not wash off. The women who meet him fear him before he even speaks a word. Those who do not fear him cannot bear his presence longer than a day. In other versions of the legend, the ship cannot reach land at all. The crew is doomed to one single act, sometimes, before storms, to meet other vessels and pass them letters. These are letters the sailors wrote home while they were still alive. Letters to families, to wives, to children who died long ago. Whoever takes these letters aboard carries the curse onto his own ship. Whoever reads them perishes together with the entire crew of his vessel. Captain van der Decken is both a punishment and a warning. Those who see him are met by a storm. Those who speak with him are met by death. Those who take his letters are met by the same voyage that awaits him. Without end. The ship itself is described in different ways in the legend, but the details repeat from telling to telling so precisely that the image can be assembled without hesitation. It is an old three-masted flight of the 17th century. The wood has darkened from water and from time. The sails are tattered, but not torn all the way through, as though they are mended constantly, yet never finished. The hull below the waterline is covered with shells and seaweed that have grown on it for centuries. Above the ship stands a light. In different accounts it is described differently, sometimes as a red glow, sometimes as a greenish shimmer, sometimes as a cold white light that comes from the masts. It can be seen for miles. It is unlike lanterns or torches. It burns steadily, without smoke, in any weather. The ship moves against the wind. This is the most important detail. No ordinary vessel of the 17th century could sail against the wind. Sailing ships of that age could move only before the wind, or at a small angle to it. But the Flying Dutchman goes wherever it needs to go, no matter where the wind blows from. This is the first sign by which sailors recognize it in the fog. A sail filled out in the opposite direction from the wind on your own ship. A wave at its bow that runs the wrong way. Sometimes the ship is visible all day. Sometimes it appears for a minute and vanishes. Sometimes it is seen only by those standing on one side of your vessel, while those on the other notice nothing. Sometimes it passes right alongside you, and you hear the creak of its ropes and the voices of its crew, voices speaking an old form of Dutch that no living person has spoken in 300 years. The crew on the deck is rarely seen, but when it is, they are thin figures without faces. They move slowly. They do not look at you. They go on doing what sailors of the 17th century did during a storm, lashing the cargo, hauling on ropes, mending sails, the work they were doing in the last hours of their living lives, and which they have gone on doing for 300 years now, without rest. A meeting with the Flying Dutchman is no accident. The captain appears where a storm is gathering. He goes ahead of it, like the leading edge of the storm, and his appearance is a warning. Sailors knew that if you saw this ship on the horizon, you had a few hours, perhaps a day, to prepare for what was coming out of the west or the south, to lash down everything that could be lashed down, to shorten sail, to pray, to whoever you believed in. But a warning did not mean salvation. The ship came before storms in which men died. It did not appear before ordinary storms that sailors passed through dozens of times in a voyage. It appeared before the ones that took a ship whole. And so, its appearance brought no joy. It frightened them more than the storm itself. Those who saw the Dutchman and survived, and there were such men, came home changed. They did not like to speak of what they had seen. If they told of it at all, it was only in harbour taverns, after the third glass, and always quietly. In the sailors' culture of the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries there was a rule. Do not mention the Dutchman at sea. Because to name it was to call it. In the form in which we know it today, the legend looks like this. A Dutch captain who curses God before a storm by the Cape of Good Hope receives the curse of an eternal voyage. The ship is doomed to circle the cape, never passing it. The crew can neither die nor come ashore. Once every 7 years, or once every 100 years, the captain is allowed onto land to seek the one who will save him. But no one can save him, because no one can love a man who is cursed. The ship appears before storms as a warning. It moves against the wind. A red light stands above it. Sometimes it passes letters to the living ships that dare to let it come near, and these letters bring death. This is the classic form. There it is, whole, just as it is told in books, operas and films. But if you ask where this story came from, who first wrote it down? When a Dutch captain whose name no Dutch archive knows turned into the most famous ghost of the sea in human history. It turns out that the classic form of the legend, the one we have just retold, is younger than it seems. There is no record of the Flying Dutchman before the end of the 18th century. None. The first literary trace appears in the year 1795, and it does not look like an ancient sea legend. It looks like a scene that has just been thought up in a book by an English traveller writing about his voyage to Australia. The scene he described was not a history. It was an anecdote that sailors told one another on deck for amusement. From that anecdote, everything began. The year 1795. London, in the bookshops, appears a book with a long title, A Voyage to Botany Bay. Its author is George Barrington, an Irishman, a famous pickpocket who, after several arrests, was sentenced to penal transportation to Australia. There he reformed, became an assistant constable, and in time a man of some standing in the young British colony. In his free hours he wrote. Barrington's book is a mixture of memoir, notes, other men's stories, and the gossip he picked up on deck during a 6-month voyage from England to Australia. Among the tales of convicts, sailors and storms there is one small episode. A page, perhaps 2. In it the author retells what he heard from the sailors, the shipboard superstitions they used to frighten one another in the evening hours near the Cape of Good Hope. It is about a ghost ship, a Dutch vessel that once tried to round the Cape in a terrible storm and could not. The ship went down with all hands, but ever since it is sometimes seen, and this is a warning to those who meet it. Barrington does not call the ship the Flying Dutchman. He gives the captain no name. He tells nothing of a curse, of a priest, of an oath against God. He simply retells what the sailors told one another as a tale to pass the night. This is the first written trace of the legend. It is a very short trace, 2 pages, and in it there is almost nothing of what we know about the Dutchman today. There is no God-defying captain. There is no curse of 7 years. There are no letters from the dead. There is no opera, no leather coat, no red glow above the masts. There is only a Dutch vessel that once sank, and that is sometimes seen before a storm. From this seed, over 40 years, everything else would grow. The year 1813. Scotland. Walter Scott, by then already a known poet, who had not yet come to his historical novels, publishes the poem Rokeby. It is a long verse romance about events of the English Civil War of the 17th century, full of passions, ghosts, castles and secrets. In one of its episodes, a character speaks of the sea, and among his words appears a mention of a ship. Scott writes of a vessel that wanders the ocean forever, a captain whose name is recalled with dread. A ship laden with gold and blood, for aboard it, the poet says, a terrible murder was done. Because of this crime, the crew is doomed to sail forever. The ship is seen before storms. Whoever sees it knows that misfortune is near. This is the same ship Barrington wrote of. But Scott adds something new to it. He adds the reason for the curse. In Barrington, the ship simply sank once, with no explanation. In Scott, a crime is committed aboard it, and for this crime, the crew bears its punishment. This is a fundamental change. Now it is no longer simply a ghost ship, it is a ship of punishment. Scott does not yet call the captain Van der Decken. He does not yet tie the story to the Cape of Good Hope. In his telling, the ship sails somewhere in northern waters, but with his poem something important begins. With him the moral layer of the legend begins. The ship becomes a punishment for sin, and that means that sooner or later a question will arise. What was that sin? And who committed it? Rokeby was a bestseller. The poem was read in every English-speaking drawing room, discussed by critics, quoted in the newspapers. The image of the cursed vessel went wandering through British literature and very quickly found the author who gave the legend its form. The year 1839. London. Captain Frederick Marryat, a former officer of the Royal Navy, a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars, an explorer, a traveller, and, in retirement, a writer. He writes adventure sea novels that enjoy enormous demand among the Victorian public. Marryat knows the sea at first hand. He spent 30 years aboard ships. He knows the languages of sailors, the superstitions of the deck, the rituals of ports. And when he sets out to write a book about a ghost ship, he does it knowing what he is writing about. His novel is called The Phantom Ship. And it is this novel that finally shapes the legend into the form in which we know it. The main character is Philip van der Decken, son of a Dutch captain who, 100 years before, cursed near the Cape of Good Hope and received an eternal voyage. The boy grows up, learns of his father's fate, and sets out to sea to meet his ship and free his father's soul from the curse. The search lasts his whole life. Philip grows old in the searching. He meets the ship several times, sees his father with a dead man's face, but release comes only at the very end. In this novel, almost all the details of the modern legend appear for the first time. The name Van der Decken, written as one word, but the same captain we know. The Cape of Good Hope as the place of the curse. The oath the captain hurls into the face of the storm. The words with which the captain calls down his punishment, which in Marryat sound like a challenge to the heavens. The ship that circles the cape, never able to pass it. A crew made of souls that cannot find their peace, a red glow above the masts. The ship's power to pass the letters of the dead to the living. All of it is there in Marryat. Why was it Marryat who could do this? Because he was a sailor. He did not invent the legend out of nothing. He gathered what sailors told one another in the ports and ordered it into a coherent story. What in the oral tradition had been scattered pieces in different versions, with different names, with different circumstances, he drew together into a single canon. After his book, to speak of the Flying Dutchman meant to speak of this story. of this captain, of this oath. Marryat's book spread across the English-speaking world within a year. It was reprinted dozens of times throughout the 19th century. It was translated into Dutch, and it was then, in the Netherlands itself, where no one had known of Van der Decken until that point, that he came to be regarded as a national folk figure. The paradox of history. The Dutch phantom captain was invented by the English. Almost at the same time as Marryat, in the year 1833, 6 years earlier, the German poet Heinrich Heine publishes his version of the legend. It is not a great novel, it is a short chapter in a book of travel sketches, from the memoirs of Herr von Schnabelewopski. Heine retells a plot that he supposedly saw on the stage of an Amsterdam theatre. In his version, a detail appears that no one had had before. The captain can be saved. Once every 7 years, he is allowed to step ashore, to seek a woman. If one is found who loves him truly and keeps faith until death, the curse will be lifted. This is an additional moral layer. In Marryat, the curse is lifted through the sacrifice of the son, the love of a father. In Heine, through the sacrifice of a woman, romantic love. Heine adds to the dark sea story the thing the Victorian public expected of any story: a love line. This makes the legend complete. Now it has everything: sin, punishment, the hope of salvation, and an impossible love as the condition of that salvation. The two versions, Marryat's and Heine's, exist in parallel. Some retell one, some the other, and in many later tellings they blend. But the main thing has already happened. By the year 1840, the Flying Dutchman is no longer simply a ghost ship near the Cape. It is a full literary myth, with a god-defying captain, a curse, the possibility of salvation through a woman's love, and all the other details passed from text to text. One thing remained: for something to happen to this myth that would make it truly immortal. The year 1843. Dresden, on the stage of the Royal Opera House, a new opera is shown for the first time by a young, not yet very well known, but already ambitious composer. His name is Richard Wagner. The opera is called Der Fliegende Holländer, the Flying Dutchman. Wagner takes the plot from Heine. He had read the German telling, and it was the version with salvation through love that caught him. Wagner himself had lived through a terrible sea crossing. In the year 1839, he and his wife were fleeing from Riga to London. The ship was caught in a storm off the Norwegian coast, and they all nearly died. The impressions of that voyage he put into music. The waves can be heard in the orchestra, the wind can be heard in the strings. The voice of the phantom captain is the voice of a man who has lived through his own death and returned. The opera did what neither Marryat nor Heine, nor even Scott could do. It carried the legend beyond the English-speaking and German-speaking reader. It made the Flying Dutchman a cultural code of European civilization. Now this story was known to every educated person, from London to Vienna. Now it was not a sailor's tale, not an adventure novel, not a poem. It was high culture, an opera that the aristocracy listened to. A musical legend that set the Dutchman alongside Faust, alongside Tannhäuser, alongside all the other great European myths of sin, punishment, and salvation. The paradox is this: Wagner's opera finally fixed the legend in place, but it also finally drew it away from what it had been at the beginning. A simple sailor's superstition about a ship that appears before a storm turned into a philosophical drama about a lost soul. To speak of the Flying Dutchman now meant to speak of Wagner, not of the Cape of Good Hope, of art, not of the sea. But the sea on which this legend was born had gone nowhere. while European writers and composers were turning a sailor's tale into a classic myth. Real sailors went on sailing past the Cape of Good Hope. They did not read Scott and did not listen to Wagner. Most of them could not read at all, but they knew their own legend, their own, not Wagner's. In their version, the Dutchman was simpler and more frightening. He did not seek love. He did not set out for shore once every 7 years. He had no son who wished to save him. He simply was there. He passed by you in the fog, moving against the wind, and that meant that tomorrow you might not see the sun. That was all. No philosophical curses, no operatic arias. In the harbour taverns of Cape Town, Batavia, Amsterdam, Boston, sailors told their stories. Who had seen whom? On what date? At what latitude? In the records of that time, the ship's logs, the captain's letters home, the harbour diaries, you can find short mentions. Saw a vessel at night with a strange glow, did not answer signals. Met a ship that moved against the wind, could not overtake it. The watch speaks of a phantom vessel, ordered them punished for drunkenness. These mentions are also the legend, but no longer a literary one. This is the legend of those who lived with it. What the connections are here between the literary canon of Marryat and Wagner and those real entries in the logs is a question to which historians have still not found a simple answer. Some hold that sailors borrowed details from literature. They read in Marryat of the red glow, and when they saw something strange on the ocean, they described it through the picture they knew. This is called the cultural filter of perception. You see not what is there, but what you have the words for. Other historians say the opposite, that Marryat wrote down what the sailors told him in the ports, that his canonical version is not his invention, but a compilation of the real stories of sailors. And that means the red glow above the masts was there before Marryat, in the oral tradition of sailors. He was simply the first who managed to write it down. The truth is probably in the middle. The literary legend and the sailor's legend fed one another. Books wrote down what sailors told in the ports, and sailors, even the illiterate ones, heard retellings of books from those who could read, and passed those retellings on to those who came into port after them. By the end of the 19th century, the two traditions had become so intertwined that to separate them is impossible. But one thing remains a fact. The literary legend grew out of the sailors' stories. And the sailors' stories, however fantastic they seemed, had real roots. When sailors in the ports of the 17th and 18th centuries told of a ghost ship near the Cape of Good Hope, they had no doubt that such a captain had once existed. They knew his name. They knew which port he had sailed from. They knew on which vessel he had vanished. And although Marryat and Heine gave the legend its literary form, the captain himself, or, as it will turn out, more than one captain, existed in the Dutch sea traditions long before anyone had begun to write books about him at all. To understand where Captain van der Decken could have come from, one must understand the age in which he sailed. And the age was this. In the year 1602, in Amsterdam, a group of Dutch merchants signed the founding document of an organization to which they gave the name the United East India Company. This was the first joint stock company in human history in the modern sense of the word. Its shares were freely traded on the exchange. Its shareholders could sell their stake to other people. Its profit was distributed once a year, what we today call a corporation. All of it began with this company. Over the 200 years of its existence, this company surpassed everything that humanity had built before it. At the peak of its activity, in the middle of the 17th century, It had its own army of 30,000 soldiers, its own fleet of 200 great ships, its own coins, its own prisons, its own fortresses on 3 continents. It had the right to declare war, to conclude treaties with sovereign states, to execute its own subjects. In modern estimates by economists, the peak capitalization of the company, converted into the money of the 21st century, exceeds the combined capitalization of the 20 largest corporations of today taken together. No corporation in history, neither before nor since, was ever so rich. And this entire empire rested on one thing: on shipping between Europe and Southeast Asia. Holland bought silver, metals, glass, and European goods in Europe. It carried all of this to India, Ceylon, Malaya, to the islands of what is now Indonesia. There it traded it for spices, pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves for silk, porcelain, tea, for opium, for diamonds. And it carried it back to Europe, where these goods were sold at a profit of 5, 10, sometimes 20 times the purchase price. All of this was possible only because the ships of the company crossed the distance. The ships went from Amsterdam to Batavia, which is the modern Jakarta on the island of Java, and came back again. One such voyage lasted from 8 months to a year and a half. On the ships, men died from scurvy, from fever, from storms, from accidents on deck, from shipboard mutinies. On the ships themselves died, thrown onto rocks, sunk by storms, taken by pirates, vanishing without a trace in the middle of the ocean. The Dutch archives have kept the numbers. Over the whole time the company existed, from 1602 to 1796, about 4,700 ship voyages were made. Of these, roughly 105, about 2.5%, vanished without a trace. This means that no one came back with the ship. Not a single sailor reached any port. Not a single piece of wreckage was found. 105 crews, roughly 5,000 to 7,000 people, vanished forever, and most of them vanished where the narrow sea passage joins the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans, in the waters by the Cape of Good Hope. The Dutch named it Kaapstad, Cape Town, the town of the Cape. They founded a colony there in the year 1652, especially so that the ships of the company, sailing from Europe to Asia and back, could stop there, to replenish their supplies of fresh water, to treat the sick sailors, to repair damaged sails, to sit out the storms, because to pass the Cape without stopping was a guaranteed killing of a third of the crew before the voyage was even done. Why was the Cape so deadly? For several reasons that layered one upon another. The first reason is geography. Here 2 oceans meet, the Atlantic from the west and the Indian from the east. Between them runs the cold Benguela current from the south and the warm Agulhas current from the northeast. Cold water and warm water meet, and when the wind passes over their contact, whirls form. Not ordinary storm waves, gigantic solitary waves, which sailors called rogue waves, the killer waves. Modern oceanography only at the end of the 20th century was able to prove that such waves truly exist and reach heights of 30 meters. Before that, throughout the whole history of seafaring, sailors told of them and were not believed, because a 30-meter wave is higher than a 10-story building. It can cover a ship whole in an instant, without warning, without a chance of being saved. The second reason is the winds. Here the so-called roaring forties blow constantly, the powerful westerly winds of the southern hemisphere. In summer they blow with moderate force. In winter, from May to September, by the calendar of the northern hemisphere, which is exactly when the ships of the company mostly sailed back to Europe, They blow at speeds of up to 100 kilometers an hour for weeks without pause. To sail against such a wind is almost impossible for a sailing ship. Ships could fight the wind around the clock and in a whole day not pass a single mile, only hold their place while the wind tore their sails to shreds. The third reason is the swift changes of weather. Over the Cape the sky can be clear and within 2 hours swallowed by a solid storm. Sailors of the 17th century had no barometers. These instruments came into wide use in the fleet only at the end of the 18th. This meant that a storm caught them unprepared. They had no time to shorten sail, to lash the cargo, to ready the ship. The storm came, and it began. And the fourth reason, the cruelest, is the coastline. If a ship broke up during a storm, the wind carried it eastward, and there, on the wild, deserted, rocky shore of southern Africa, the ship met its death. In the 17th century, these were thousands of kilometers of coast, without a single port, without a single lighthouse, without a single settlement. Whoever sank by the Cape sank without witnesses. And the bodies were never found. In the Dutch archives there are lists. In them, the names of captains no one ever met again, the dates of their last word, the coordinates where the ship was last seen, and the standard entry lost with man and mouse. That is, with everything that was on board, down to the last living creature. Among such entries there are several that hold special meaning for our story. In the sailors' tales of the 17th century, there are several real captains who are named as possible models for the Flying Dutchman. The most famous of them is Bernard Fokke. Fokke was a Dutchman, a captain of the company, who lived in the middle of the 17th century. His name is well documented. He appears in the lists of the company, in the harbour records of Batavia, in the letters of other captains. He was a real person with a known biography. This is what was told of him. Bernard Fokke sailed from Holland to Batavia in an unbelievably short time. A standard voyage lasted 8 to 10 months. Fokke made it in 3. Sometimes, say the sailors of those years, he made it even faster, in 84 days. He could come home from Asia in the time it took other captains not even to reach Cape Town. Such speed was impossible. An ordinary Dutch fleet or a great galleon of the 17th century could not sail so much faster than other ships of the same kind. But Fokke sailed, time after time, year after year, and he was paid more and more because the swift delivery of spices was worth a great deal. Among the sailors a story went around. Bernard Fokke was not merely a masterful captain. He had a pact with the devil. He paid for his speed with the thing people have always paid the devil, a part of his soul. Some said that what held his ship on the water was not the force of the wind, but the force of hell. Others that Fokke held knowledge forbidden to decent men. Still others claimed that he simply beat his crew half to death and kept aboard a regime that let him wring the last out of a sailing ship. In some year of the 1670s, the exact date is lost among the versions, Bernard Fokke sailed out of the port of Batavia, bound for Holland. He passed normally as far as the Cape of Good Hope, and beyond that he passed nowhere. The ship did not appear in Cape Town. It did not appear in Amsterdam. It did not appear in any other port. They searched for him as they searched then, sending questions to other ships that might have seen him. No answers. Bernard Fokke vanished together with his vessel and all his crew. A few years later, in the ports, they were already saying, "It is him. It is Fokke, the one who sailed faster than all, the one who had a pact with the devil." Now his ship sails by the Cape without end, and he himself stands on the deck, with no right to die. The devil came for his payment. Was Bernard Fokker the model for van der Decken? Perhaps the names do not match, but in the Dutch oral tradition names changed easily. The circumstances match: a Dutchman, a captain, vanished by the Cape, with the reputation of a man who had ties beyond this world. He is the most probable real candidate for the one whose story, 150 years later, Marryat wrote down. But the main thing is something else. Fock is a real man, whose real fate became the core of a future myth. He existed. He vanished. And from the moment his disappearance became known in the ports, a whole legend began to look for its name. But if Bernard Fokker is a real man with documents, then with Hendrick van der Decken the situation is exactly the opposite. No Dutch record of a captain by that name who vanished by the Cape exists at all. This is acknowledged by every modern scholar of the Dutch Sea archives. The name van der Decken, which means from the deck, a fairly characteristic Dutch surname that real people truly bore in the Netherlands, is not found in the lists of captains of the company who vanished in the region of the Cape. No captain's certificate, no harbour record, no letter, no report to shareholders mentions such a captain. He does not exist in the documents. This does not necessarily mean that he never existed at all. The documentation of the company has not reached us in full. The 17th century is an age in which far fewer papers were kept than later. Fires, floods, wars, the carelessness of archivists, all of this could have destroyed the record of a particular captain. But the fact remains, we have no confirmation at all that Hendrick van der Decken was a real person. Then where did this name come from? Here it grows interesting. The first mentions of a captain with a name resembling Van der Decken appear not in Dutch sources, but in English ones. In Marryat, who writes in English, the main character bears the surname Van der Decken as one word, like an anglicised Dutch name. In Heine, the captain is also nameless in the text, and only in later stagings did they begin to call him Van der Decken or Van der Decken. In Wagner's opera, the captain is called simply the Dutchman, der Hollander, with no name. The name Van der Decken became fixed to him only afterward, as the version of Marryat and the German operatic tradition blended together. So the probable truth looks like this. There was a real captain, Bernard Fokker. He vanished by the Cape. His disappearance gave rise to an oral legend. 150 years later, the English writer Marryat, gathering material for his novel, heard this legend in the ports. He gave his hero a name, Philip van der Decken, the son of the phantom captain, which then in the oral tradition transferred to the father himself. And so the name Van der Decken, born from an English pen, returned into Dutch sea culture already as the name of the phantom captain. Until the 19th century, not a single Dutch sailor knew this name in connection with the legend. This is a paradox that all scholars of the legend know. A literary character with a name invented by an author came to be perceived as a real captain with a documented biography. And now, if you ask in a Dutch museum about Van der Decken, they will tell you of him as a half-real historical hero, although documents to confirm it do not exist. Besides Fokker, the Dutch archives mention other captains who could have become the real basis of the legend. Among them, several names are most often given. Jacob van der Heide, a captain of the company of the middle of the 17th century, who, according to some records, was known for his cruelty toward his crew and the reputation of a man whom sailors feared more than hell. He vanished on the route by the Cape in some year of the 1660s, the exact date disputed. The same was ascribed to him as to Focke, that he sailed fast because he had a pact. No other trace his fate left behind. Caspar Behrens, a less-known captain who vanished in the year 1658. Of him there is an entry in the harbour documents of Cape Town. Captain Behrens, the ship Wapen van Horn, sailed out of the port on the 13th of May. He did not arrive in Batavia. Place of disappearance unknown. That is all. Nothing more. Hendrick van Opdam, a captain who, according to the oral tradition of Dutch sailors, truly did curse during a storm by the Cape, and could not pass. Some historians believe that it was his name, Hendrick, that later mutated into Hendrick van der Decken. But there is practically no documentary trace of this figure either. How many such captains there were together, no one knows. 105 ships of the company vanished, never coming home, over the 200 years of the company's existence. Each of them had a captain. Each captain had his own biography, his own crew, his own cargo, his own last note to his wife before sailing out of port. Each of these 105 fates could have become the core of the legend. And perhaps the legend is not one man. It is the combined shadow of all 105, of those whose names we remember, like Focke, and those whose names no archive kept. The collective memory of sailors about hundreds of friends, relatives, acquaintances who went one way and did not come back. This too explains why the legend turned out to be so enduring. Because behind it stood not one god-defying captain. Behind it stood an age of mass death in the ocean, which had no other explanation but a myth. One question remains: why did sailors who spent half their lives on the ocean seriously believe in a ghost ship? After all, these were practical people. They knew how to read charts. They knew how the wind worked. They could fix their position by the stars. Something that to many landsmen of that time seemed like sorcery. They were almost the engineers of their time. So why did they believe in Van der Decken? Because for them, belief did not contradict practical knowledge. It is for us, people of the 21st century, that a picture of the world is either scientific or mythological, with a wall between them through which one cannot cross. For a sailor of the 17th century, there was no wall. He knew how a sextant worked, and he knew that in the ocean live creatures that do not obey ordinary laws. One kind of knowledge did not contradict the other. The fact that you know how to pass the Cape in a sailing ship does not exclude the fact that the Cape is a place where the sky can open and a man can hear a cursing voice. To this were added the conditions: months on the ocean without land, the same food every day, ship's biscuit, salt meat, foul water, scurvy, which slowly loosens the body apart, exhaustion from 4-hour watches, loneliness, a man seeing the same 40 faces for 40 months in a row, the darkness of moonless nights in the middle of the ocean, when only your vessel is visible and nothing else to the horizon. In such conditions, the brain does things it does not do on solid ground. It begins to see what is not there. And to tell apart what is not there from what is there becomes harder with each week at sea. So when a sailor said, "I saw the Flying Dutchman," he could have been completely sober, completely serious, completely certain that he was telling the truth. He truly saw something. Perhaps it was another ship that in the fog seemed strange. Perhaps it was a mirage, an optical phenomenon that by the Cape of Good Hope happens often. Perhaps it was the hallucination of an exhausted brain. And perhaps, from his point of view, it truly was a ship that had no right to exist in the normal world, and which nonetheless was there. As long as these conditions existed, and they existed throughout the whole age of the sailing fleet. From the 16th to the 19th century, the Flying Dutchman was seen. Again and again. Dozens of times, hundreds of times. And among these hundreds of cases, some made it into official documents, into ship's logs signed by captains, into reports accepted in admiralties, into the diaries of people whose station did not allow them to invent. And one of the most famous such entries was made by a man who 30 years later became king of the greatest empire in human history. Before moving on to particular cases, we must agree on one thing: what we count as testimony and why some accounts are worth more trust than others. In the sailors' world of the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, accounts of the Flying Dutchman were an ordinary matter. Almost every old sailor, if you questioned him in a harbour tavern, had his own story. One saw it himself. A second heard it from a brother who served on a merchant ship. A third knew a man who sailed with someone who had seen it. Such accounts went around the port from hand to hand, gathering details, changing the dates and circumstances. They left no documentary trace. They cannot be verified. Most of them have not reached us, and the part that has reached us already as a retelling of a retelling. Alongside the oral tradition there existed another. Official entries in ship's logs, reports to the Admiralty, the personal diaries of people whose station did not allow them to invent, because a diary could become a matter for inspection, for quotation, even for a court hearing. In such documents, a lie cost dearly. If an officer of the Royal Navy wrote into the log of his ship something that had not happened, he risked his career, his rank, his pension, sometimes his freedom. So from here on, we will clearly separate two things: what is reliably documented, the records that can be found in the archives and read with one's own eyes, and what belongs to the sailor's tradition, the stories that for centuries went among the people of the sea but have no solid sources. The first we will call testimonies, the second tales. They must not be confused. And it is exactly on the confusion of these two categories that most books about the ghost ship rest, the ones that pass off legend as fact. Let us begin with what is reliably documented, because such a case truly exists, and it is louder than any harbour tale. The most famous and best documented case of a meeting with a ghost ship is the observation by the crew of the British corvette Bacchante in July of the year 1881. The background is this. In the year 1879, the British fleet sent the training ship Bacchante on a 3-year voyage around the world. Aboard, together with the regular crew, sailed 2 young princes of the royal house. The elder, Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, 15 years old at the start of the voyage. The younger, George, 14, these were the 2 sons of the Prince of Wales, who himself later became King Edward VII. The 2 youths were preparing for future service in the Royal Navy, and the 3-year voyage was a part of their education. The princes kept a joint diary. More precisely, the entries were made mostly under the guidance of their tutor, the Reverend John Neil Dalton, who accompanied them on the voyage. The diary later came out as a separate book in 2 volumes, The Cruise of Her Majesty's Ship Bacchante. This is an official publication, printed in the year 1886. It passed through the eyes of the Admiralty, of the Prince's tutor, and of the royal persons themselves. Every word in it is checked. This is not a case of someone supposedly seeing something. It is a published document tied to the English crown, which any person can find in a library and read. In this document there is an entry, dated the 11th of July, 1881. The ship was sailing in southern waters near the coast of Australia. The entry describes what happened at 4 o'clock in the morning. It says roughly this: ahead on the course appeared a strange red light, as if from a phantom vessel fully lit from within. In this light stood out the masts, the rigging and the sails of a ship. It passed at a certain distance and then vanished. The other vessels sailing in company with the Bacchante also noticed something unusual and exchanged signals. In the entry it is separately noted how many people saw the vessel: the lookout on the forecastle, the officer of the watch, other members of the watch. In all, as recorded, 13 people at the same time. Among them, the princes themselves. This is the most important detail: 13 witnesses. Among them, 2 future heirs to the British throne. The entry is not from one man in a fevered state. It is a collective observation, entered into the ship's log and later published in a book issued under the patronage of the Crown. What happened next, that same day? In the morning, the sailor who first saw the phantom vessel fell from the rigging, the upper part of the mast, and was killed, striking the deck. The entry of his death is in the log. Between the night vision and the morning death, a few hours passed. One can build several versions of what truly happened. The most prosaic, an optical deception. The Bacchante sailed in waters known for mirages. The temperature contrast between layers of air over different currents could create the reflection of another vessel sailing far beyond the horizon. The red light could have come from the running light of that vessel, refracted through layers of cold air. The lookout, most struck by what he saw, in the morning, in the darkness before dawn, in the tiredness of a night watch, could simply have lost his footing on the rigging through inattention. One can build another version. 13 experienced sailors of the Royal Navy would not have mistaken a real ship for a mirage. If they describe a red light above the masts and a vessel that vanishes at the end of the observation, then they saw something that matches that description. What it truly was, no one will say. And between these two versions stands an entry in the diary of a 16-year-old boy who, 39 years later, became King of Great Britain. This entry cannot be struck out. It exists, it is published, it has been read by many people. And whatever that red patch on the horizon turned out to be, for George himself it remained forever a memory that he tried neither to confirm nor to refute. He simply wrote down what he saw. George's brother, Albert Victor, did not live to see the younger one's coronation. He died in January of the year 1892 at the age of 28 from complications of influenza during a pandemic that swept across all of Europe. Had he lived an ordinary life, it would have been he who became king, and George would have remained a minor member of the royal family. Fate ruled otherwise. Does this have any bearing on what the two of them saw that night in the year 1881? Of course not. It is a coincidence. But a coincidence of the kind that sailors of those times would not have passed over in silence. Whoever saw the Dutchman, they said, something will come to him. The case of the Bacchante is the firmest fact in the whole history of sightings of the ghost ship. Everything that follows yields to it in firmness. Besides the Bacchante, the literature about the Flying Dutchman gives many other meetings. Here, honesty is needed. Most of them have no solid primary sources. These are not records that can be found in an archive and read, but stories that were passed around in the sailors' world and then made their way into popular books about the ghost ship, often without any indication of where exactly they came from. This does not mean they were wholly invented. It means we cannot verify them. So we present them as they are, as a part of a living tradition, not as documents. They tell, for example, of a case somewhere in the middle of the 19th century when a merchant vessel passing by the Cape of Good Hope in a storm supposedly met a ship that bore down straight upon it under full sail, which in such a wind is impossible. According to the tale, the other ship did not answer signals, passed right alongside, and the crew made out its deck. Empty, without a single person at the wheel, after which the vessel dissolved into the dark. Who exactly recorded this, on what ship, under what flag, the tradition has not kept. So it is a tale, not a testimony. They also tell of 4 officers of the British fleet who, at the beginning of the 20th century, supposedly saw near the South African coast at night a vessel with old sailing rig, moving against the wind with a dim shimmer above the masts. The details of this story differ in different tellings. The year changes, the number of witnesses, the circumstances. This is a sign that we are dealing with a tradition that lived and changed, not with a fixed document. A story apart is the one sometimes told of a German submarine of the Second World War. According to the post-war memories of one of its commanders, his boat in southern waters supposedly met at night an old sailing ship that had no right to be there, in a zone of combat operations, thousands of miles from the places where such vessels still sailed anywhere. According to the tale, the commander watched the ship for about 10 minutes, after which it vanished. There is no documentary confirmation of this. The story is known from oral and memoir sources that are hard to check, so it too remains a tale. And they tell as well of a Dutch merchant ship of the middle of the 20th century, which supposedly in the region of the Cape of Good Hope met an old sailing vessel invisible on the radar. According to this story, the captain saw the vessel with his own eyes, but the instruments did not register it, and within a few minutes it vanished. The name of the ship and the exact year are given differently in different tellings, which again betrays in it a tradition, not a record. All these stories are united by one feature. In them the details are the same. An old sailing ship, movement against the wind, a strange shimmer, the absence of a crew on the deck, a sudden disappearance. Such sameness can mean 2 things. Either all these people saw something truly alike, because the conditions by the Cape are the same for everyone, or each new teller, without realizing it, fitted his story to the already known canon, adding the details that the legend is expected to have. Most likely, both worked at once, and this is exactly why these tales should be treated as folklore, valuable, interesting, but not proof. But alongside the tales of the Flying Dutchman itself, there is one case that belongs neither to the legend nor to folklore. It is a wholly real, documentarily attested story of an actual ship from which all the people truly vanished without a trace. It has nothing to do with the curse, but it is so often tied to the Dutchman that it must be examined separately. On the 4th of December, 1872, the British brig Dei Gratia, crossing the Atlantic, met another vessel. It was moving strangely under partly raised sails with no clear course, as though no one was steering it. The captain of the Dei Gratia, David Morehouse, recognized the vessel. It was the American brigantine Mary Celeste, which he knew because its captain, Benjamin Briggs, was an acquaintance of his. The ships had left New York a few days apart and were both bound for the Mediterranean. Morehouse sent men aboard the Mary Celeste. What they found became the basis of one of the most famous sea mysteries in history, and this time a mystery entirely real, with documents, with records, with a court hearing. On board, there was not a single person. Captain Briggs, his wife, their 2-year-old daughter, and 7 members of the crew, 10 people in all, had vanished. The single lifeboat was gone. The ship's chronometer, the sextant and some navigation documents were gone. The ship as a whole was sound, it held on the water, its hull had no serious damage. The cargo, over 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol, was almost entirely in place. The supplies of food and water were enough for more than half a year. The crew's personal belongings remained in the cabins, clothes, pipes, even money. The last entry in the ship's log was made 10 days before the meeting. In it there was not the slightest hint of danger. 10 people simply vanished from a ship completely fit to sail, taking with them only the lifeboat and the navigation instruments, and left everything else behind, including their own money and belongings. This case was officially investigated. In Gibraltar there was a maritime court hearing because the crew of the Dei Gratia claimed a reward for the rescue of the abandoned vessel, and the investigator suspected a possible murder or fraud. Witnesses were questioned, the ship was examined, records were drawn up. All of it has been preserved in the documents of the British Admiralty and the Gibraltar Court. No proof of a crime was found. No explanation for the disappearance either. Since then, dozens of versions have been put forward. The most plausible sounds like this. The industrial alcohol in the hold began to evaporate through changes of temperature. Several barrels really did turn out empty. They had leaked. Vapours of alcohol could have built up in the hold, and the captain, fearing an explosion, ordered everyone evacuated urgently into the lifeboat, taking it to a safe distance from the ship and tying it on with a rope. This was a standard precaution. But then a squall struck, the rope holding the boat broke, and 10 people in an open boat in the middle of the Atlantic were left without their ship, which the wind quickly carried away. The boat did not survive the waves. The ship sailed on by itself, empty. This is only a version. There is no proof. The bodies were not found and could not be found in the Atlantic. What truly happened aboard the Mary Celeste in November of the year 1872, no one knows even today. Why has this story grown so firmly together with the legend of the Flying Dutchman? Because it gave the legend the thing it had always lacked, a real, documented, legally attested case of a ship without a crew. The Dutchman was a story people believed in, but could not prove. The Mary Celeste was a fact people could prove. Here are the records, here are the witnesses, here is the court hearing, but could not explain. 2 things met. The legend received its real proof, and the real mystery received its legendary frame. Writers of the 19th and 20th centuries, among them the young Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote a story about the Mary Celeste and added invented details that later came to be taken as real, did everything to make these 2 stories merge into one. But in truth, the Mary Celeste is not a ghost ship. It is the real tragedy of real people, among whom was a 2-year-old child. It does not appear before storms, it does not sail by the Cape for 300 years, it sank or was broken up, like all ordinary ships, a few years after those events. Its story is frightening, precisely because it is real, and because there is no answer to it, not through a curse, but because the sea simply does not return those it has taken. If you look at all of this together, at the firmly documented case of the Bacchante, at the real mystery of the Mary Celeste, at the many unconfirmed tales, you can see several common features. The first. All the reliably documented cases describe one and the same circle of details. A strange light, a vessel that does not behave the way a normal ship should. a sudden disappearance, or an absence of people. If you remove the mystical frame, what remains is the description of something real, but unusual, an optical phenomenon, an abandoned vessel, an incomprehensible silhouette in the dark. The second, not one of these cases ever received a final, official explanation. Not because explanations do not exist, but because none of the possible explanations closes all the details completely. Always something remains that does not fully fit the rational version, and it is exactly onto this remainder that the legend hooks. The third, most of these stories are tied to one region, the southern Atlantic, the region of the Cape of Good Hope, the southern waters. Not the Baltic, not the Mediterranean. Exactly there where the legend was born, exactly there where the ships of the company sank. The exception is the Mary Celeste, which vanished in the northern Atlantic, but that is exactly why it stands apart, and is not in itself a part of the legend of the Dutchman, only attached to it later. And here is the last. All these people, both those whose names we know exactly, like Prince George, and those whose names are lost in the tales, saw something in a sea that by itself kills people in proportions hard to imagine. In the waters by the Cape of Good Hope, over the whole history of seafaring, more ships have perished than in any other region of the world's oceans. Here, even now, the wreckage of century-old ships is found. Here, even now, modern vessels perish, not sailing ships, but steel cargo ships of tens of thousands of tons. But can rational explanations be found for what these people saw? What real physical phenomena could lie behind all these observations? Can the sea itself give birth to ghost ships with no mysticism at all, by the pure force of its physics, its geography, its chemistry? It turns out it can. And these explanations are in themselves so strange that they sound like a legend, just from the other side. If you take a map of the world and look at the southern edge of Africa, you see a strange thing. The continent ends in a narrow cape that juts out into the ocean. To the west of it, the Atlantic Ocean. To the east, the Indian. Between them, a narrow passage that ships had to pass through to go from Europe to Asia and back. This passage is called the Cape of Good Hope. The name was given to it by the Portuguese King John II in the year 1488, after his navigator Bartolomeu Dias first rounded this cape and returned with the news that there, beyond it, a way to India opened up. The king wanted the name to instill hope in future seafarers. Dias himself, in his time, suggested another name, the Cape of Storms. He thought it more honest. The king did not listen. The name Cape of Storms was left in Dias's personal letters and in forgotten manuscripts. Officially, the cape became the Cape of Good Hope, only there was no good hope there. From the very beginning, this place took ships faster than they were built. Over the whole time of intensive shipping past the Cape, from the end of the 15th to the middle of the 19th century, more than 1,000 great ships perished in its waters. These are only the documented cases. How many ships vanished without a trace, leaving not a single record, no one knows. In modern diving expeditions near the South African coast, the remains of Portuguese galleons of the 16th century, Dutch flights of the 17th, British frigates of the 18th are still found. Here is the greatest underwater graveyard of ships in the world's oceans. Why? The answer is made of several elements, each of which is dangerous in itself, and together they turn the sea into a machine for destroying ships. The first element is the geography of the underwater currents. Along the western coast of Africa, from south to north, runs the cold Benguela Current. It carries icy water that rises from the depths of the Antarctic. The temperature of its surface layers is 10 to 12 degrees Celsius, even in summer. Over this water the air cools. It becomes heavy, dense, with high humidity. Fogs form, thick, low, such that visibility falls to tens of meters. Ships that entered the zone of the Benguela Current could sail for weeks in a milky white fog, seeing neither the shore, nor the stars, nor even one another. Along the eastern coast of Africa, from north to south, runs the warm Agulhas Current. It is one of the fastest and most powerful sea currents in the world. It carries warm water from the tropics, 23–25 degrees. Over it the air is warm, light, unstable, thunderstorms form, powerful upward flows, local rain squalls. These two currents meet exactly by the Cape of Good Hope. Cold and warm, heavy and light, with fog and with thunderstorms. At the point of their meeting, one of the most complex oceanographic zones in the world is formed. The water here mixes constantly. The temperature can change by 10 degrees over a distance of 100 meters. Above the surface of the water, incomprehensible vertical flows of air arise. Air from the cold layer suddenly rises through the warm layer, and the reverse. This creates very swift local changes of weather. In half an hour, in one place it can grow dark, a squall can rise, a downpour can come on, and just as suddenly disperse. For a sailing ship of the 17th century, such a zone is a deadly trap. A sailing ship reacts slowly to changes of wind. It needs time to shorten sail, to rebuild the rigging, to turn the course. When a squall strikes in 10 minutes, the ship simply has no time. The wind catches it in full sail, lays it on its side, tears the masts, floods the deck. In some cases, the ship manages to right itself, having lost part of its rigging. In others, it does not. It goes to the bottom, and of its loss no one ever learns. The second element is the waves that form in the zone where the two currents meet. Ordinary storm waves have their maximum height, which is determined by the speed of the wind, the length of its action, and the space over which the wind drives the water. In most oceans, this maximum is 15 to 18 meters. That too is terribly much. A wave the height of a 6-story building is able to sink any ship, but under certain conditions, waves form that go far beyond these limits. They are called killer waves, or in English, rogue waves. Killer waves are solitary waves that form unexpectedly among the ordinary storm waves. Their height can reach 25, 30, in extreme cases even 35 meters. That is more than the height of a 10-story residential building. They rise from the water in an almost vertical wall, a steep, almost straight slope of the front part, and just as sharp a drop behind the crest. Before such a wave there sometimes forms a deep trough, the water seems to level out and sink 10 to 20 meters below the normal level. A ship that falls into this trough finds itself in a valley, from which in a moment a wall of water will rise. Picture it from the deck of a sailing ship of the 17th century. The captain stands on the bridge in a storm among ordinary waves 6, 8 meters high. The ship rises and falls, normal for a storm, the crew trained. Suddenly, within a few seconds, the water before the bow sinks into a trough, so deep that the ship literally falls down the sloping water. Then the captain lifts his head and sees that the water before him has risen in a wall higher than the foremast. At the top of this wall, a foaming crest that is already beginning to collapse downward. The captain has 2, perhaps 3 seconds before the wall falls on the ship. It will not pass under it, as ordinary waves pass. It will collapse from above. A mass of water equal to thousands of tons will fall on the deck all at once. The ship will not hold, the deck will be staved in, the masts will be snapped, the boats will be torn from their fastenings. Everything that could hold on the deck will be carried into the sea. Until the end of the 20th century, the existence of such waves was considered a sailor's tale. Oceanographers maintained that the mathematics of wave processes did not allow the formation of solitary waves of such a height. There were graphs, formulas, models, and all of them showed that a wave higher than 16 meters was impossible in a normal storm. Sailors who survived a meeting with a 30-meter wave came home with stories that even their colleagues did not believe. These stories passed through the taverns and ports, and then returned to the ocean in the form of legends about monsters, sea spirits, ghost ships. The first documented confirmation of the existence of a killer wave came in the year 1995. On a Norwegian oil platform in the North Sea, an automatic sensor recorded a solitary wave with a height of 25.6 meters. Beside it, the ordinary storm waves had a height of 12 meters. A storm too, but an ordinary one. 25.6 meters fit into none of the formulas of that time. It was a surprise for all of oceanography. After this case, the mathematical models were rewritten. It turned out that under certain conditions, especially where storm waves go against a powerful current, the energy of waves can add together and form solitary outpourings of water of extreme height. Exactly where storm waves go against a powerful current. Exactly where it is formed by the Agulhas current, which goes to meet the southwesterly storm winds of the roaring Forties. Exactly by the Cape of Good Hope. Today it is known that the Cape is one of the 3 main places in the world's oceans where killer waves form most often. By the estimates of modern oceanographers, here a wave higher than 20 meters passes on average once a week. Once a week. Every one. In waters through which, over the history of humanity, millions of vessels have passed. How many of them met such a wave, one cannot say exactly. But one can say that most of those that met it did not return. The third element is optics. In the air over the water by the Cape of Good Hope, conditions for strange optical phenomena arise regularly. The most famous of them is called the Fata Morgana, a name that came from an Italian tale about the enchantress Morgan, sister of King Arthur, who supposedly created visions of castles in the sea. In the scientific sense, it is a kind of optical refraction, when light, passing through layers of air of different temperature and density, is bent at such angles that distant objects become visible in a greatly distorted form. A ship that is really located 100 kilometers beyond the horizon, so far that it is physically impossible to see it, can appear before the eyes of an observer as a vertically stretched picture that seems to hang in the air over the water. Sometimes this picture is upside down, the ship is seen turned over. Sometimes in the form of several copies of one and the same vessel standing one above another like images reflected in vertical mirrors. Sometimes in the form of a glow that resembles the silhouette of a ship, but without clear detail. The Fata Morgana occurs in many regions of the world, but by the Cape of Good Hope, with its sharp temperature contrasts between layers of air over the cold Benguela and the warm Agulhas currents, it occurs especially often. Modern footage from the air and from ships has recorded hundreds of cases of this phenomenon precisely in this region. Many of them are so realistic that even experienced observers confuse them with real vessels. On the radar they do not appear, of course, because there is no vessel there at all. There is only an optical reflection. The object itself, which is being reflected, may be sailing on an entirely different course or standing in a distant port altogether. Now think of a sailor of the 18th century, or the 19th, or even the 20th, before radar appeared on ships, which is already after the Second World War. He has no way at all to check whether he is seeing a real ship or its optical reflection. There is no radar. There is no radio link. The phantom ship returns no signal from a searchlight because it is not there. If a sailor sees a vessel moving against the wind, it could have been a real vessel, for which the wind around the bend had a different direction. Or it could be the fata morgana of a ship sailing 500 kilometers away, where the wind truly is different. To tell them apart is impossible. Now add to this the red glow. It too is explained physically. Under certain conditions of atmospheric fluctuation over the water, sunlight reflected from the surface of the sea and passing through layers of air of different density gives distant objects a characteristic red illumination. This is not mysticism. It is the ordinary aberration of light in the atmosphere. A ship that is really 50 kilometers away at a certain time of day, especially at dawn and at dusk, can seem lit from within, especially if its hull reflects high in the sky the position of a sun not yet visible from the point where the observer stands. 13 sailors of the Bacchante saw, at 4 o'clock in the morning, a red glow above a sailing ship on the horizon. The sun had not yet risen, but it had already risen over those parts of the sky that lay higher. The light of the sun, still invisible from below, could pass through the atmosphere at a low angle, reflect from the clouds, be coloured red through dispersion in thick layers of air, and light up a sailing ship that was passing 50 kilometres further on and a little higher above the optical horizon. If there was a sailing ship there. If not, then it was some other vessel, perhaps with a fire on board, perhaps with an accident, perhaps simply with lighting that seemed abnormal through the distortion of the atmosphere. Does this not explain the vision completely? Not completely. Details remain that do not fit this model. In particular, that the vessel vanished suddenly, without passing beyond the horizon. But one of the properties of the Fata Morgana is exactly that. The picture appears and vanishes in a matter of seconds, because the slightest change in the layers of air is enough for the whole optical corridor to fall apart. There is one more element that few mention. In the region of the Cape of Good Hope, there exist local magnetic anomalies, areas where the Earth's magnetic field deviates from the normal by several degrees. This is caused by the features of the geological structure of the seabed, where large deposits of iron-bearing rock create local distortions of the magnetic field. For a sailing ship whose only navigation instrument was the magnetic compass, such anomalies meant the loss of course. A captain who was certain he was heading northwest could in fact be moving west or southwest. The compass lied because it did not point to the true magnetic pole. In calm weather, under a clear sky, this could be noticed by checking the course against the stars or the sun. In a storm, in fog, at night, it was impossible to notice. The ship went not where the captain thought, sometimes not there at all. And this was discovered when the vessel by chance ran onto a shore, onto rocks, onto a shoal. Or it was never discovered, the vessel vanished in the ocean because it had gone beyond the limits of its water and provisions, moving on a wrong course for weeks. How many ships of the company that officially vanished in the region of the Cape, in fact ended up hundreds of kilometers away from it because of magnetic anomalies, no one knows. But a part certainly did. and this added to all the other dangers that made this region uniquely deadly. The last element is the state of the sailors themselves. Because everything we have spoken of, the winds, the currents, the waves, the mirages, the magnetic anomalies, these are objective physical phenomena. But it is a human being who perceives them, and a human being aboard a sailing ship passing the Cape of Good Hope is not in the best of condition. By this point, the ship has already been at sea for 6, 7, 8 months. The supplies of fresh water are limited. It is issued at half a litre a day per person, sometimes less. The food is biscuit made of flour, which after half a year becomes hard as stone and full of grubs. Salt meat that grows mouldy in the barrels, sometimes dried fish. There are no vegetables, there is no fresh fruit. Among the sailors, scurvy develops, a disease caused by a lack of vitamin C. The first signs are bleeding gums, fatigue, pain in the muscles. After a few weeks, the falling out of teeth, the opening of old wounds that will not heal, swellings, in the late stages, mental disorder. Scurvy literally destroys the brain because vitamin C is needed for the synthesis of neurotransmitters. The sick begin to see what is not there, to hear voices, to lose their bearings in time and space. To scurvy is added general exhaustion. The standard watch on a ship of the 17th century was 4 hours, then 4 hours of rest, then 4 hours of watch again. It is almost impossible to get proper sleep on such a schedule, especially when during the so-called rest one has to eat, mend clothes, repair the rigging, and carry out dozens of other tasks. Sailors lived for months in a state of chronic lack of sleep. To this was added the darkness. Ships sailed without electric lighting. On deck, at best, an oil lamp, in the cabins, candles, which were guarded as a treasure. For most of the day a sailor saw only what a weak flame lit. The eyes grew used to the half-darkness, and then, going out on watch, onto the deck, where it was darker still, especially on the moonless nights of southern latitudes. A sailor saw things that might be there and might not. In such conditions, hallucinations are not an exotic thing, but the norm. Modern studies of the mental health of polar explorers, sailors, people who are in prolonged isolation show that after 3 or 4 months of harsh sameness, part of those people begin to have periodic visual or auditory hallucinations. Not pathological. Passing, simply the brain, exhausted by the sameness of stimuli, begins to draw in the picture for itself. Sometimes these hallucinations are collective. Several people at the same time see one and the same thing. This is a strange but documented phenomenon. Collective suggestion under conditions of general exhaustion works. If one person in the dark on deck says, "Look, there is a ship," the others may see what is not there. Not because they are lying, but because the brain, placed in a certain context, fills in the details that are expected of it. Now let us bring all of this together. The ships of the company and of other European companies of the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries passed the Cape of Good Hope under conditions that consisted of several harsh elements at once. First, a geography that creates very swiftly changing weather. Second, 2 currents that meet and give birth to solitary waves of extreme height. Third, the constant westerly winds that make movement against them almost impossible for a sailing ship. Fourth, optical phenomena that regularly show observers ships where there are none. Fifth, magnetic anomalies that knock the only navigation instrument off course. Sixth, a crew that, after months at sea, is in a state of chronic exhaustion, scurvy and passing hallucinations. All of this together created a situation in which a ghost ship was almost inevitable. If thousands of vessels pass this region over centuries, in harsh conditions, with exhausted crews, someone is bound to see something. And among the things seen there is bound to be something that cannot be explained. Not because it is truly supernatural, but because the conditions are such that a rational explanation requires knowledge that a sailor of those years simply did not have. He could not know of killer waves. Even the science of his time did not know of them. He could not know of the Fata Morgana. Optical phenomena began to be studied systematically only in the 19th century. He could not know of magnetic anomalies. Geophysicists discovered them only in the 20th century. He could not know of his own hallucinations. Psychiatry in the modern sense did not yet exist. He had only one way to explain what he saw. This way was given to him by culture. A ship that moves against the wind, with a red glow, in a storm, before a storm, is the Flying Dutchman. So it was explained by the sailors who saw the same thing before him. So it was explained by his father and his grandfather. So it was explained by the priest on the shore. So said the captains who came home with scars on their faces and a polite reticence in their eyes. The Dutchman is not an invention. It is a rational explanation of an irrational experience within the picture of the world available to a sailor. What we today break down into physics, optics, psychology, meteorology, and several other sciences, for him was a single whole, a single story, a single ship that sails forever by the Cape, and that is seen only by those who will soon die. Can we say that we have understood everything, that there is now no mystery left? That the Dutchman breaks down into physical phenomena and the psychology of exhaustion, and the legend remains only a literary fact, with no real mystery behind it at all? Not quite, because the sailor's legend of the ghost ship exists not only in European culture. The very same legend of a vessel that cannot die, of sailors doomed to sail forever, of a ship that appears before disaster, exists in Japanese sea tales, in Chinese ones, in the Scandinavian sagas, in the legends of the Malay peoples, in the stories of Polynesian seafarers, at different ends of the planet, among peoples who had no contact at all with Europeans and learned of them only in the age of colonization, there is the same legend. In different forms, with different details, with different names of captains and ships, but the same one. How did this come about? Does it mean that in human psychology there is something that compels a seafaring people, any of them, anywhere, to invent a ghost ship? Or is it simply a coincidence? Or is it the parallel development of similar myths in answer to similar conditions, a human being on the ocean, far from shore, before the threat of death? This question leads us into very deep layers of human psychology, and it is exactly there, in these layers, that the last layer of the legend of the Flying Dutchman hides. The European Flying Dutchman is not the only ghost ship in the world. In the legends of every people that lived by the sea and built vessels, there is their own ship that cannot die, their own captain doomed to sail forever, their own sailor who returns from the water to warn the living of something terrible. This is so recurring a plot that it cannot be explained by borrowing. The Japanese did not read Marryat. The Polynesians did not listen to Wagner. The African fishermen on the shores of Lake Malawi did not know of the Cape of Good Hope. But in all these cultures, independently of one another, the very same story exists. A ship seen before disaster. Sailors who did not reach the shore. Souls that find no peace on the water. Why is this so? Does it mean that in the human brain there is something that compels a sea-faring people, any of them, anywhere, to create one and the same myth? And if so, then what is this myth truly about? In Japan there exist the funayure, literally the boat ghosts. These are the souls of sailors and fishermen who perished at sea and found no peace. They remain bound to the place of their death, to the sea, to their very own boats. Japanese folklore describes them very precisely. The funayuri appear at night, in the fog, near fishing boats. Sometimes singly, as thin white figures that rise from the water and swim beside the boat. Sometimes as a whole crew, like a ghost ship with a full company, that passes by a modern fishing vessel. Their main occupation is to ask. They knock on the side. They ask the living fisherman for a ladle for scooping out water, or a bucket, or a scoop. In Japanese sea culture, this is the most important moment. If a fisherman gives the funayure what they ask, an ordinary whole ladle, they will begin to pour water with it into his boat. They will keep pouring until the boat sinks. So the ladle is given with the bottom knocked out, one that lets it look like a real one, but does not let it hold water. Then the funayure cannot do harm. They cannot fulfill their function, to take the living to themselves. This myth exists in documented form from the Edo period, which is the 17th and 18th centuries by the Western calendar. That is, at the very time when the legend of the Dutchman was forming in Europe. Japanese sailors and European sailors at the same time on opposite ends of the planet, with no contact with one another, created a legend about a ghost ship with a crew that cannot die. What it shares with the Dutchman. A ship that appears before disaster. A crew that can find no peace. A meeting with it, a warning or a death sentence. The difference. The Japanese funayuri have no single name, no single captain, no single story of sin and punishment. They are collective souls. Not an individual fate, but a shared one. This says more about the Japanese worldview, in which the individual is less pronounced than in the European, but the structure of the myth itself is the same. In Chinese sea culture there is a similar but somewhat different legend. It is called the ghost junks, or the ships without a name. These are vessels seen in the South China Sea, in the Strait of Taiwan, near the islands of what is now Malaysia. Old wooden junks of the time of the Ming dynasty or earlier periods, with tattered sails, with lanterns that burn without a visible source of fire. Their peculiarity is complete silence. European sailors who met such vessels in the 19th century recorded one and the same detail in their logs. The junk passed by, very close, and on it not a single sound could be heard. No voices, no creak of rigging, no splash of water by the hull. As though it moved in another air, in another space, that did not carry sound to the observer. The Chinese tradition explains it like this. These are vessels that have lost their way in time. They were sailing from one port to another, but on the way something happened, a storm, a pirate attack, a mutiny on board, a curse. The crew perished. But the ship itself did not understand that its crew was dead. It goes on sailing. It goes on holding its course. It sails in the same direction as 300 years ago, not noticing that the port of destination no longer exists. The dynasty has changed, the trade routes have been moved to other seas. The ship sails on its own side of time. Sometimes it is seen from our side, sometimes not. This image of a ship that does not notice that it no longer exists is psychologically astonishingly strong. It is not an evil ghost, it is not a punishment, it is a vessel that simply never received the message of its own death. In Scandinavian mythology there is the ship Naglfar. It is not quite a ghost ship in the sailor's sense. It is a mythological vessel from the tales of the end of the world, from Ragnarok. But its details correspond so closely to the archetype that it deserves mention. Naglfar is a ship built from the nails of the dead. Every deceased Scandinavian whose nails were not cut before burial added his material share to this vessel. The ship grew, endlessly slowly, over centuries and millennia. When it is ready, on it will sail an army of the dead to the last battle. It is a vessel assembled from invisible components, from the final remains of those who are no longer alive. A ship of the dead. For the dead. The Scandinavian tradition here joins two elements. The first, seafaring as the chief occupation of the Vikings, whose culture rested entirely on the ability to build ships. The second, an obsessive fear of the dead who might return. It is no accident that in the Scandinavian sagas there are detailed descriptions of funeral rites, exactly how the dead must be laid. How to cut their hair and nails, how to make their grave so that they cannot come out of it. If everything is done correctly, the dead one stays dead. If something is missed, he returns, and perhaps he will sail on the Naglfar. The ship itself in the sagas is described similarly to the Dutchman. It appears at the worst moment, at the end of the world. On it sail those who should not walk the sea. It foretells catastrophe. And it is inevitable. Among the Polynesian islanders, for whom the ocean was literally home, their ancestors came from the Hawaiian Islands to New Zealand, to Easter Island, to the Marquesas, having crossed thousands of kilometers of open Pacific on catamarans. There are their own legends about ships that do not reach the shore. Among the Maori there is a tale of warriors in a canoe, the war canoes of the Polynesian peoples, who perished at sea and whose souls sail in a canoe among the waves forever. They can neither reach the shore nor sink into the ocean and find peace. Sometimes they are seen by fishermen in the fog, sometimes on the beaches, where they come out of the water but go no further than the strip of wet sand. They remain where the water and the land meet, like a boundary figure that belongs neither to the water nor to the land. Similar legends exist among the tribes of the West African coast who lived by fishing on the Atlantic shore of what are now Ghana, Senegal, Liberia, a ship or a canoe that appears before a storm. The souls of the drowned who call from the water. A prohibition on naming the one who perished at sea because it may call him back. These legends are not connected with the European tradition. Many of them were documented by anthropologists in the 19th and 20th centuries in the form of oral history passed from generation to generation. They are not the result of European sailors' stories retold to the local inhabitants. This means one of two things. Either all these legends have a very ancient common source, so old that it goes back to a time when humanity had not yet scattered across the continents. Or, and this is more probable, the human mind, when it meets a certain situation, produces one and the same image independently of cultural context. The question then stands like this: what situation and what image exactly? The ship in human culture is a special image. It has several properties that make it the ideal carrier of a myth about death and the infinite. The first: a ship is an artificial island that moves. It creates a space in which people live, work, eat, sleep, dream. But this space does not belong to the land. It floats in an alien medium. It is separate from the ordinary world. Everything that happens on a ship happens as if outside normal time and space. If someone dies on the way, he is often not brought home. He is buried in the water. This means that a person vanishes not the way those who die at home vanish. His body does not remain in the land of his ancestors. It goes somewhere, into the water, into the unknown. The second, every sea voyage is a small death and rebirth. You say goodbye to your loved ones, not knowing whether you will see them again. You go into a space where you depend entirely on the weather, on luck, on the mercy of nature. You come back, if you come back, a different person. One who has passed through something that those who stayed cannot understand. In all sea cultures there exists a special status of the sailor. It is not merely a profession, but a social category, a person between worlds. One who was there where the rest of people have not been. The third, a ship is the most complex mechanism that humanity created before the Industrial Revolution. To assemble and sail a sailing vessel is work that requires hundreds of hands, precise coordination, the knowledge of hundreds of small skills. If the crew vanishes, what remains on the ship is a mechanism full of the traces of human activity, knots that someone tied, stores that someone laid in, entries in the log that someone kept. All of this speaks of people who were here and who are no longer. This is the strongest image of death in human culture. Not an empty room, not a ruined house, but a working mechanism from which the makers have vanished. The fourth, the sea has its own psychological quality which acts on people universally. The boundless surface of water stretching to the horizon without a single landmark, nothing to fix the gaze on, nothing for the thought to push off from. A person who looks long into the ocean begins to feel something very like what psychologists call the oceanic feeling, the sense of one's own self dissolving into the infinite. This experience can be exalted and terrifying at the same time. In such a state, it is easy to imagine that something can come out of the water that should not be there, that what once was people is still there, in the water, in a form that cannot be seen directly. All of this together creates the conditions for a particular myth. The ghost ship is not a chance image. It is an almost inevitable image as soon as a human being begins to go out to sea. If you look at the Flying Dutchman through the prism of all its global counterparts, you can see that the main theme of the legend is not the ship and not the captain. The main theme is the impossibility of finishing. The Dutchman cannot reach a port, cannot die, cannot free himself from the curse. The crew cannot go ashore, cannot find peace, can neither live nor cease to live. The Japanese funayuri cannot pass into the other world because they hold on to their death. The Chinese junks cannot understand that they no longer exist. The Scandinavian Naglfar is endlessly, slowly assembled, never reaching its single battle. The Polynesian souls remain between the water and the shore. The African drowned call from the water, having the strength neither to come out nor to vanish. All of this is the image of an unfinished action. An unfinished life, an unfinished death, an unfinished voyage. And it is exactly this that makes these legends so strong. They speak of something that every person feels, the fear of being stuck halfway, the fear that death will come before the main work is finished, or the reverse, that death will not come when it is long since time, and you will go on living, with the strength neither to move forward nor to stop. This is a universal human fear. It exists in any culture, in any age, in any psychology. Sailors simply shaped this fear into a particular image, a ship that sails and sails, reaching nowhere. The Dutchman is frightening not because he is dead. He is frightening because he cannot become dead, cannot finish, cannot put a full stop. He is a living metaphor for what happens to a person when they are stuck in one moment of their life and cannot get out of it, and cannot die together with it. Everyone who has lived through a long illness, a long unresolved grief, a long guilt, knows this feeling from the inside. This is not a sailor's story. It is a story about a human being, and it is exactly for this reason that this legend lives. Not because it is about a ship, but because it is about us. The 21st century. Ghost ships appear in the news from time to time, not as legends, but as entirely real vessels. In the year 2003, off the coast of Australia, a Taiwanese fishing vessel was found with a completely empty deck. Its crew of more than 10 men had vanished, the ship drifting on with no direction. In the year 2007, near the same Australian coast, a yacht was found adrift with the engine still running, the table set, everything in its place, and not a single person aboard. Modern abandoned ships. Modern silent decks. Modern questions without answers. Where did the people go? Why does the vessel sail on? What was on board? Each such case, when it becomes public, briefly returns attention to the old legend. Journalists write headlines about a new Flying Dutchman. Experts explain how exactly a ship could be left without a crew. The internet fills with theories and guesses. Within a week, the subject is forgotten until the next such case. But the Dutchman himself, the one from the Cape of Good Hope, with the red glow above the masts, with the crew that cannot die, goes on living. Now no longer in sailors' stories, because sailing vessels have almost ceased to exist, and steel cargo ships sail with radar and satellite communication, and the sailors hallucinate less, because there is no scurvy, because the crews rotate. Because the situation is different. He lives in books, in films, in Wagner's opera, which is still staged on the best stages of the world. He lives in the conversations that people have about death, about unfinished affairs, about the impossibility of moving forward. He sails where he can always be found, on the thin boundary between what we know and what we feel, between science and legend, between the sea as a geographic object and the sea as an archetype of the human psyche. And on this boundary he remains, a ship that can neither reach land nor vanish, with a captain who is neither living nor dead, with a crew that neither exists nor does not exist. Like every great myth, he remains as true as the one who tells him believes him to be. On the 11th of July, 1881, at 4 o'clock in the morning, 13 men on the deck of the British corvette Bacchante saw a ship out on the ocean. We began this story with this image, and to it we return at the end. Only now, between this image and us, lie thousands of words of history about the pickpocket sailor who first wrote this legend down, about the Scottish poet who added a moral dimension to it, about the retired captain of the English fleet who made it a canon, about the German composer who set it to music and carried it onto the stages of Europe. Between us and those 13 people on the deck lie the names of the captains of the Dutch East India Company, whose ships vanished in the storms of the 17th century without a trace. There lies the geography of the Cape of Good Hope, with its meeting of two oceans, with its killer waves, with its Fata Morgana. There lie the Japanese Funayure, the Scandinavian Naglfar, the Chinese ghost junks, the Polynesian souls in their canoes. All of this is part of one story, a story that does not end with our having told it. Now we know several things that we did not know when we were only beginning. We know that the classic legend of the Flying Dutchman, in the form in which it is retold in schools, in books, in articles about seafaring, is a literary creation of the 19th century. The God-defying captain by the name of Decken, the curse near the Cape, the possibility of salvation through a woman's love. The letters from the dead, the red glow above the masts, all of this was finally put together by the English adventure writer Frederick Marryat in the year 1839. Before him, the legend existed in fragmentary form as a sailor's tale of a ship that sinks near the Cape and then appears before storms. Without the captain's name, without a clear story of sin and punishment, without operatic drama, we know that behind this legend stands a real historical tragedy. 105 ships of the Dutch East India Company vanished without a trace over 200 years. 5,000 to 7,000 people left their homes and did not return. Most of them perished near the Cape of Good Hope, in waters that to this day remain one of the deadliest regions of the world's oceans. A real captain, similar to Van der Decken in the circumstances of his disappearance, did exist. His name was probably Bernard Folk, and his ship was lost near the Cape in the middle of the 17th century. But whether it was exactly he who became the model for the legend, or whether it was someone else from among the 100 vanished captains, or all of them together as a collective shadow, no one will say for certain. We know that the sailors who, over the centuries, saw the Dutchman, saw something real, not invented, not dreamed. They had every condition for it. 2 currents, the cold Benguela and the warm Agulhas, create near the Cape solitary waves up to 30 meters high. The contrast of the temperature layers of air over these currents gives rise to one of the strongest fata morganas in the world, an optical phenomenon in which ships hundreds of kilometers beyond the horizon appear in the sky as stretched, inverted, mirrored copies. Magnetic anomalies knock ships off course. The sun, still invisible from below, colors distant objects red. And sailors, worn down by scurvy, lack of sleep and loneliness, perceive all of this with that shift of perception which makes every shadow into something more than a shadow. We know that this same legend, in different forms, exists in all the sea cultures of the world, not as a borrowing from Europe, but as a parallel creation of the human psyche, which meets the ocean and does not know how to make sense of it. And we know one more thing. Despite all this knowledge, scientific, historical, psychological, cultural, the Dutchman has not vanished. He has not vanished from our culture because we explained him. Because an explanation does not close a legend, it only takes it apart into pieces. And the pieces, assembled again, give the same myth as before the explanation. It is usually thought like this. If you explain a phenomenon scientifically, it stops being mysterious. Once thunder was thought to be the voice of the gods. People learned that it is electrical discharges, and thunder ceased to be a god. Once eclipses of the sun terrified peoples. They prayed, made sacrifices, prepared for the end of the world. Today eclipses are predicted to the second a minute in advance. Tickets are bought to observation centres. They are filmed on phones. There is no more magic in them. With the Dutchman, this did not happen. Although each of his elements has been explained separately, the ship that sails against the wind through the Fata Morgana, the red glow through atmospheric dispersion, the disappearance of vessels near the Cape, through killer waves, the hallucinations of sailors, through scurvy and exhaustion, the Dutchman himself, as a whole image, has not dissolved. He goes on living. Wagner's opera fills full houses in the 21st century. Films about the ghost ship come out every few years. The image of a leaning mast and a man upon it, looking out at the endless horizon, goes on acting upon us the same way it acted on Marryat's readers in the year 1839. This is no accident. It is a property of myths in general. A great myth is not an error of explanation, not a filling in of gaps in knowledge. A great myth is the recognition of something that exists in human experience even without knowledge. The Dutchman stays with us because what he speaks of, the being stuck, the incompleteness, the impossibility of arriving, is not explained by the physics of the ocean and the psychology of exhaustion. It is part of how a human being is made. Every person, at some moment of their life, becomes a ship by the cape that cannot pass. For one, it is a job they cannot bring themselves to leave. For another, a relationship that ended long ago but was never closed. For another, a grief that no longer burns but does not let go. For another, a guilt that others have long forgotten but you remember every day. This is not a pathology. This is not a terrible fate. It is simply a part of what it means to be a living human being. We all have our cape, we all have our storm, before which we stand for years, with the strength neither to pass it nor to turn back. The Dutchman is our image of this state, outwardly beautiful, of the sea, with a sailing ship and a red glow, and inwardly it is about us, about what it is to be unable to finish, to be unable to die when it is time, to be unable to live when one must, to stand on the deck and look into the endless distance, knowing that there is no port ahead. What remains when everything is explained? This is what remains. There remains an entry in the diary of a 16-year-old boy who, 39 years later, became King of Great Britain. An entry about a ship with a red glow above the masts, which they saw at night, 13 of them. This entry is printed, it is in the archive, it can be read. Whether there was truly a ship there is unknown. Whether it was a fata morgana, an optical deception, a collective illusion, is also unknown. But the entry itself exists. It does not vanish from our explanations. There remain the names of those who left Amsterdam for Batavia and did not return. 105 ships, 5,000 to 7,000 people. Each of them had their own biography, their own wife or mother waiting for them in the port, their own plans to come back with spices, with money, with stories. Not one of them carried out those plans. They all remained in the ocean, somewhere on the bottom, without markers, without gravestones. The Dutchman is the only monument they have, one ship for all of them. There remains the sea itself. By the Cape of Good Hope, on average, one large vessel still sinks every year. Steel cargo ships, modern fishing trawlers, even warships fall into waves that mathematically should not exist, into storms that come on within half an hour, into magnetic anomalies that knock them off course. In the 21st century, with all the satellites, radars and weather forecasts, this stretch of ocean remains what it was in the 16th. A place where the sea does to people what it has always done. And there remains the legend itself, in the form in which it has come down to us from Marryat, Heine and Wagner, a captain who swore to pass the Cape at any price, a curse of an eternal voyage, a ship that appears before storms, a crew that can neither live nor die, a red glow above the masts. All of this remains with us as one of those stories that humanity tells itself and cannot stop telling. Somewhere right now, at this very second, by the Cape of Good Hope, a ship is passing. A great modern cargo ship, perhaps Chinese, perhaps Danish, perhaps Dutch. A fine irony if Dutch. On its bridge stands a captain with a mug of coffee. The radar shows clear water around for 30 miles. The weather forecast is steady. Everything is normal. But the ship is passing where once Bernard Fokker passed, where the ships of the Dutch East India Company sank, where Prince George saw the red glow, where the killer waves rise once a week. where the Fata Morgana shows sailing ships that are not there. And if the captain happens to look at the horizon at a certain minute, in a certain weather, in a certain state of his own exhaustion, he may perhaps see a silhouette, an old sailing ship with 3 masts, moving against the wind, with a dim red glow above the rigging. The captain will blink, the silhouette will vanish, the captain will return to his mug of coffee. He will make no entry in the log. He will think, it seemed so. Tiredness, a long voyage, nothing unusual, and the Dutchman will sail on. There, where he has been going for 350 years now. He does not arrive. He cannot arrive. He simply sails, because that is all that is left to him. A ship that cannot become a ship. A captain who cannot become a human being. A crew that cannot become a memory. As long as the sea exists, and as long as people sail upon it, he will be there. Sometimes he will be seen, sometimes not. It does not matter. He is there, even when he is not visible. He is part of the ocean, like the salts, like the currents, like the wind. Or, perhaps, part of ourselves, which we see in the ocean when we look into it long enough. Was there ever truly a Captain van der Decken? Did he curse God before the storm? Did he receive an eternal voyage for it? This is a question to which there is no answer. And perhaps there should not be one, because the legend is alive as long as the question stays open. And the Dutchman sails as long as we go on telling of him. Good night.